Atheist Edge. I am Chris, and I am honored to be joined today by John Loftus, author of such books as Why I Became an Atheist, The Christian Delusion, which we are just getting through discussing in our Atheist Christian Book Club, and you were actually here last night, as of the time we're filming this, having a discussion with Travis Dickinson, who's the Christian author of another book that we read. So it's the morning after. Had a chance to think about the discussion a little bit. How do you think things went last night?
Well, I would like to have had all the time.
Of course, yeah.
I always seem to share the podium with a response. It's you don't dare allow me to talk straight to people without having a scholar to respond, and it's kind of discouraging. Others they'll interview straight up, but somehow they have to figure like they want to call someone in to debate me just in case I get out of line, make something, a sentence that nobody can answer but this guy. So, but yeah, it was all right, I guess, yeah. I always hate looking at myself afterwards, so I don't usually bother.
Yeah, frankly, I feel the same way, honestly. So we did a lot of talking about the, maybe not last night, but when we read your book initially, we did a lot of talking about the desire test for faith. The thing that I like about it is that it's pretty simple and straightforward, to the point that apparently it's how I deconverted before I even realized that was a thing that had a name to it. And the premises seem pretty simple enough for anyone to appreciate. It's the idea that, most people are largely influenced in what they believe by the surrounding culture, which is why we can identify certain cultures and geographical regions with certain religions. And the idea that it's best to, if you want to honestly evaluate your faith, you need to step outside of it and see what it looks like from other perspectives. And yet, we're reading these follow-up books by Christians, and I listened to some of your appearances on the Unbelievable podcast and some others where you're still getting pushback from believers. And where do you think that's coming from if the premises are so straightforward?
Well, it's because it threatens their faith. The one thing that it does, well, two things, is it helps people overcome their indoctrination, because indoctrination is the leading cause of people believing a certain sect within a religion, and especially if it's bolstered by threats of hell. So the more the hell is thrown on top of the indoctrination, the less likely someone is going to walk away from that anytime soon. And the other thing is the influence of confirmation bias. Confirmation bias, built on top of indoctrination, almost guarantees that somebody's not going to leave their faith in their lifetime. At least it would certainly be the case in previous generations. But now with the internet, which is causing people to lose their faith, quite rapidly. It's changed some, but the outsider test for faith is going to help overcome the indoctrination that most people have and the confirmation bias. It asks the believer, especially kids who just became adults, or if they want to become adults, or if they're going to college, for the first time and they're away from their parents' influences, that they are asked to do something that they never were able to do before, and that is to examine their faith as if they just woke up, and are looking at their faith in the midst of a sea of faiths to see whether or not there's evidence. In other words, try to hypothetically picture yourself as a non-believer, like you weren't raised. And I know it's tough, and I know that people can't do that, some of them, but to the degree that they want to be honest, then they will. And when they do, they'll find out that their faith has no more evidence than other faiths that they reject.
Now, you're right. It's very hard to come outside that confirmation bias and with what you were raised to believe. And especially I think it's a problem with our education system. People aren't necessarily taught the critical thinking skills that they may require to actually get outside and honestly evaluate their religion. And plus, if with the sheer variety of apologetics books and Christian stores, especially around here in Texas, I don't know about in Indiana, but is there any advice you would give to people who may not have that skill set but do want to honestly give their faith their evaluation as to how they can go about doing that?
Well, one way is to consider how they reject the other faiths that they do. And now some of them will reject those faiths. They'll say, well, since mine is true, yours must be false. And that's a lot of them. They just, they assume, since they assume theirs is true, the others must be false. But they also do at times engage those other religions by looking for the evidence, looking for their claims, finding inconsistencies. They're called defeaters, looking for defeaters for that religious faith. And, it's just, I'm saying it's tough to do. That's why there's so few converts, away from, it's a conversion process no matter what, but deconversion is what they usually call it. There's so few, really, comparatively speaking, from those who've been indoctrinated with threats of hell and with the built-in mechanism we all have for confirmation bias. But if they want to be honest, then they need to look for defeaters of their own faith. And uniqueness doesn't count. You say, well, no one in the history has ever been risen from the dead, so therefore my faith is true. Well, that's a unique claim, granted, okay? That's a unique claim. Not so unique if you were actually to investigate it. There have been other resurrected saviors. But the uniqueness doesn't mean it's true. It just means it's unique. And they'll criticize, like, the Islam because, well, you don't have a sacrifice, for sins. But, and so therefore that's unique to us too. Uniqueness doesn't count because the Muslims will say, well, God, Allah, has the ability to forgive without a sacrifice. And that makes actually more sense to me that, if you're going to forgive, just forgive, And you don't need to, sacrifice somebody, flail them all around. That's actually a hindrance for Christian belief. So defeaters, you're looking for defeaters, and you're looking for, you need to wake up one morning and say, what if my faith is not, true? What if I was indoctrinated incorrectly? And read books that you have never read before, outside the box. Visit places. And engage free thought people, humanist people, and atheists, and Hindus for that matter, or Buddhists, or Scientologists. Go and talk to these people and look and see how certain they feel about their faith, and ask yourself, how can they be certain that their faith is true? Because I am certain that my faith is true, and you might have an awakening about that. But I'm just saying you have to try, and you have to use the perspective to assume that your holy books are written merely by men and women, and not by God, and ask yourself, is this the product of what a divinity would say, when it comes to certain things? Don't try to explain them away. It says slaughter all the Amalekites, So, is that what a divine being would do? Or, there's evidence that child sacrifice was pleasing to the Old Testament God, and is that what a divine being would do? And then when you think about the kinds of things that a divine being says in the Bible, but neglects others, like don't own slaves, don't beat women or rape them, on and on, things that he should have said but didn't say. You say, well, that doesn't sound like much of a divine creator. And go deeper and deeper and deeper. It's tough, but a lot of us have done it.
And on that subject, one of the chapters in the Christian Delusion talks about God's failure to communicate properly. And it goes in, there's a whole list of things that should have been said, could have been said clearer, things that believers have interpreted in a variety of ways over the centuries. And some of them are pretty clear-cut, like God has instructions for slavery, and he never says, don't do this. Some of them seem to have been interpreted a certain way by people to negative ends, like that God never says African Americans are inferior. People interpret the curse of Ham that way, stuff like that. But given the propensity that we know believers have to take really any convenient verse of the Bible that they can twist to their own ends and do so, do you think there's any way that God could have done a written communication, even if he was as clear as we would theoretically want a divine being to be, and not have some Yahoo preacher with an agenda find some way to twist it to his own ends?
Well, yeah, I really do. One thing is limit the number of words. Yeah. Now, the more words you say, the more they can be misinterpreted, you know. But look, I suggested some possibilities in my book, Why I Became an Atheist. I wrote the first chapter of Genesis from a scientific perspective that could be understood by people of that day, and wouldn't be discredited later as science progressed. I mean, you can do that. I did that. And there's other things. I mean, there's certain things about us that might misinterpret things, so I won't deny that. But you certainly don't give them fodder.
Yeah.
You know, this instruction, you can beat a slave, but so long as he doesn't die, you're in the clear. Listen, unequivocally condemn slavery, you know. Say this is not, you know, acceptable, and you won't do it. And say it 3 or 4 times if you have to. Be consistent about that. And don't say, you know, you should not suffer a witch to live. Don't say that you know, homosexuals are to be put to death. I mean, don't say those things, God. Please, don't say those things next time around. And in the Matthew, you have the Jews saying, well, as Jesus is being led off to the slaughter, in that narrative, they say, well, let his blood be on us and our children. Don't have them say that. Or if they say that, God, don't have it in your book, okay? Look, there might be some things that could be misunderstood. Okay, fine. That's because of the nature of communication. But don't give them any fodder.
Yeah, let's make it hard. Yeah. Yeah, it's just the fact that Christians somehow wound up on both sides of the slavery issue, at least in the U.S., kind of speaks poorly for God's ability to communicate what he actually wants people to do in regards to slavery.
And, you know, he didn't do the same thing when it came to doctrine, because you have doctrines like once saved, always saved. You have doctrines like of salvation by faith versus salvation by works. And you have the idea of the priesthood of all believers versus a priesthood. And those kind of things right there were, or baptism, you know, how do you baptize and when, who gets baptized, infants or adults. Those are the kind of things that the Christians slaughtered each other over in the wars after the Reformation, the wars after Martin Luther and Zwingli and others, you know, decided, well, let's just get back to, or Calvin decided to get back to the Bible. And there were 8 French wars of religion, and then there was the 30 Years' War, and they didn't have, you know, they didn't have tanks, they didn't have airplanes with guided missiles, but if they did, that would have been a massacre, you know. So the ISIS people over there in the Middle East, they're fighting with weapons that had the Christians had, it would have been near genocide in some places, and even then, Germany and the area of Czechoslovakia was certain towns were just decimated during those wars, during the 30 Years' War, over those items. Now, if God were God, he could foresee that people can't quite understand so well. He's not going to be so nebulous about whether or not everybody's a priest or not. He's going to say, you're all priests, you know, whatever that means, right? You're all priests. And I'm going to say it again. And Peter's going to say it, and Paul's going to say it, and Mark's going to say it, and John's going to say it. It's just so there's nothing unclear there. At least don't give them any fodder, you know.
Yeah.
And salvation by faith, the salvation by faith, forget the works, if that's what he wants to communicate, if there's a God. But we have an incompetent God, we have an ignorant God. Not only that, but we have not an omnipotent God and not an omniscient God. It's through and through, you would come to the conclusion, as I have, and many of us, that this does not represent the views of a divine, good, omniscient God.
And does it ever seem like when there's something really important that they want to get across or that they want to enforce on people, let's say, this is God's word, this is God-breathed, and then when there's some difficult passage like slavery or some other inconsistencies in the Bible, they'll be like, oh, that was the culture of the time, or that is the human writers being given agency to put a spin on it.
In the Old Testament, we read that God was going to destroy his people, Israelites, or at least he did. He says 3,000 of them were bit by snakes, I think, at one point. And he says to Moses, "You and Aaron step back. I'm going to destroy these people because they're a stubborn people." You know, and why? Well, God had something he wanted to get across to them. At some point, he had to make with them, and he was able to threaten them with death if they didn't, abide, by his command. And you're saying that Christians are saying, you mean a God like that couldn't have enforced the rule that women are equal? I'm sorry, no, it's a cultural thing, they would say. It's cultural. Women, they're just, naturally inferior, back in that day, but we know better now. And, you mean the God that you actually believe in, the one in the Old Testament that threatens people with death to get his point across, or his laws across, couldn't have enforced those kind of laws? He could have enforced democracy. Instead, we have a theocracy in the Bible, which was the model for the kings in the Middle Ages. He's just, it's like there's nothing in the Bible that could have been, that can't be interpreted as having been spoken in those days and in those times. There's nothing in there, and if you were to talk about prophecy, there's no prophecy in the Old Testament that matters. We can talk about that. I mean, it didn't come true, or they weren't prophecies to begin with. So this God is he looks like a big fatherly figure in the Old Testament figure. I mean, and that's it, a person, or persons, where God whispers in their ears and then they speak. These are God's words.
Yeah, especially given the fact that God apparently had, since the Old Testament times, has somehow figured out a way to get his point across now without slaughtering 30,000 people at a time or sending fire from heaven to kill the unworthy or stuff like that. So obviously it's possible, and human nature hasn't changed, so it raises the question of why you start with that until figuring out a different way to go about it.
And, he could have appeared at several different junctures in history and said, okay, now, you guys got it wrong. I just want you to know, here's how you're supposed to, interpret it. But no, that didn't happen either. Well, I don't know why. And do a couple miracles, in front of a big cathedral in Europe, or maybe several different cathedrals in Europe, no, sorry, that God, no. He can convert Paul on Damascus Road, but apparently he didn't want to, help anybody along during those years either.
Well, he shows up on toast sometimes, so
that's funny.
He likes the subtlety.
Yeah, he used to show up on mountains of fire, and that's so we read, but now that's all he's relegated to.
Well, if they had toasters back then, I'm sure he would have figured out a way, but he had to be a little.
Now, if you are offended that we're ridiculing your faith, it's because your faith is to be ridiculed. I'm sorry. We're also reasoning. We're also arguing. But this is ludicrous. We asked how you evaluate faith. Well, ask if you were a non-believer, what would you regard it as? And as you can see, we rightly can laugh at it. It's laughable, I think.
Yeah, and being outside the faith for several years now, and going back and looking at certain passages, we did a video a couple weeks ago where I happened upon a passage at the end of Leviticus where God describes the penalties for not following the laws, and it's stuff like there will be diseases spread among you and you will bury your daughters, and it's all horrifying stuff.
Yeah.
And the idea that when I was a believer I would have been like, yeah, I'm okay with that. Is it so foreign to me now?
Yeah, God is God. He can do whatever he wants. Well, he actually steps on his foot a lot of times because he faults the people in Jeremiah's day, I think, with child sacrifice. You're sacrificing to the god Moloch, and actually, how I read that is that God was simply jealous. You have to look at that. We have to talk about that. God was simply jealous that they were sacrificing to the wrong God. He wasn't upset itself at the sacrifice, but he was upset at their sacrifice, and so what he did, because he was mad, he says, "You shall eat your babies." That's what God says. Okay, so God's upset with child sacrifice. They're getting killed. They're killing babies, right? Mm-hmm. And how does he solve that? How does he punish them? Killing more babies. This is crazy. Eat them.
He's a fan of ironic punishments, I guess.
That's crazy.
And the one thing that actually comes up in our group fairly often, actually James brings it up, I think he brought it up last night actually, since we're talking about God communicating to us. We like to, from the atheist side, we like to bring up contradictions in the Gospels, and especially the resurrection account, which of all accounts should be the most clear thing in the whole Bible. But instead you have one or two men or angels with a tomb that's open and closed at the same time and things like that. And James's his response to that is, well, okay, you have multiple accounts. If they all say the same thing, you're going to say they're cribbing off of one another. But if they're all different, then you say they're contradictory. So atheists want to have it both ways. What would you say?
Well, first off, they are cribbing out. They're each copying from one another. Mark was the first gospel, and you can see you can see the exact Greek sentences and even descriptions of, well, Jesus went from this place to the other place, and that is the same Greek phrase that's used in Luke and is used in Matthew. So they do crib off one another. There's no doubt about that. They crib off the Old Testament prophecies, or Old Testament, I won't say prophecies, like Psalms 23 and 69 and Isaiah 53, which were not predictive at all, and they were just descriptive. And the suffering servant was actually Israel. Isaiah 49 verse 3 says it clearly and plainly that my suffering servant is Israel, and yet the New Testament misinterprets that. So they take these Psalm 23 and 69 and others, and they rewrite, they write some stories based on those verses, like the crucifixion, and he cries, my God, why have thou forsaken me? That's right out of Psalm 22. And then Psalm 22 is not a prediction. It's just simply a statement of someone crying out in pain. So it's rightfully so that Jesus might say, I'm in pain. That's nothing. That proves nothing, you see. They are cribbing off each other. But when it comes to the resurrection, they also have differences. And these differences are important if you're trying case, I mean, in some sense, it's even worse, because if they're copying each other, but when it comes to the resurrection, they don't, they make stuff up, well, then that's a bigger problem, because they had it right there to be able to copy, but they didn't. So they had all kinds of different theories about things, and it's not something that would hold up in court. It'd be something that would be questionable, because one after the other, well, what did you see and when? Well, Mark would say, I didn't see anything. I mean, I heard a voice, if he's writing his story about the women at the tomb, they heard a voice saying, Jesus is risen, but that's it, and then the next story says something different, the next story says something different. So it's actually worse than that. It's why didn't you keep your story straight when you could have and didn't?
It seems like the easiest thing would be to do is, okay, you don't want to have one single account, because then we're going to say, okay, it's uncorroborated, it's just the one account. But you can have the same story from different perspectives. You can have the women's perspective on things, you can have the disciples' perspective on things, you can have Pilate's perspective on things, saying that, like, hey, people keep saying this guy I crucified is running around Jerusalem still. I don't know what's going on with that. But instead you have the exact same, like you said, almost literally the same in some cases, the same third-person omniscient perspective, just with various details, which in themselves turn out to be contradictory.
Now, on this point, I want to talk directly to James Walker, my host here. An amazing man. He's a great guy. He's a former Mormon who is now an evangelical apologist. And he knows Mormon theology better than I do, or ever will. But what I know is there were 11 witnesses, so-called witnesses, of Joseph Smith's golden place, and he knows this, and he also knows the stories of what happened as they were interrogated, as they were questioned. A few recanted. He knows these stories better than I do. I'm just from memory trying to remember them. One was his uncle. One was a benefactor of his, and something like that. Right? I think all 11 of them. I wish I knew my facts better to bring this up, but he knows them. Now, so let's go back in time and talk about the 11 witnesses for Jesus, the disciples, the apostles, minus Judas, because whatever happened to him or whether he exists is beside the point. He probably didn't exist. It was just an amalgam of Jewish thought. So 11 disciples. Paul says, they saw Jesus, blah 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 blah. Well, we don't get this additional information. It's not there. Now, on the Mormon case, it was there. It was found. We could interrogate them. We could cross-examine them. We could follow the paper trail. We can't when it comes to the Gospels. So we don't know about these other apostles who say they witnessed Jesus. We don't know what they believed about Jesus. We don't know whether they. We would like to interrogate them. Was he risen bodily or spiritually? Was it a ghost? We can't examine. How do you know this? I mean, did you know this? I mean, Did you know this in a dream? Joseph apparently was convinced in a dream that Mary was pregnant with God's son. A dream. That's right, a dream. So did you see this in a dream? Did you see this in a vision? We want to know, did any of them recant? Did you recant? You know? I mean, and some of them may not have existed. How do we know they exist just because they're there? I mean, okay, so-and-so is in this list. We can't interrogate them. We can't cross-examine them. That's one of the main reasons I can't believe, because we don't have eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses are people who saw something that we can interrogate. Hearsay evidence doesn't matter because you can't cross-examine them. So you know the story with Mormons. Apply that same kind of questions and skepticism toward the early disciples and the resurrection. Since we can't interrogate, how do we know they didn't fall in the same type of category that the 11 witnesses did with the golden plates?
Yeah, and there's all the stories and traditions about them going to their martyrdom, very few of which come from the actual Bible. I think maybe John only is described, his death by Herod is described in the Bible. Or John the Baptist, rather.
Right. There's a Stephen in Acts chapter 6 or 7, he was stoned.
But, I mean, having studied under William Lane Craig, you're familiar with a lot of these apologetics, and you know how Christians are going to react to these kind of things, and you know all the philosophy and kind of logical arguments that people will bring to the table. Are there any Christian arguments that you think are obviously not rock solid and unassailable, but things that you think atheists should really take the time to reckon with, and because they're better than some of the other arguments for Christianity?
Well, first off, there is no such thing as Christianity. There are only Christianities. You travel around the world, you travel back in time. There are so many different views of what it means to be a Christian that it's really hard for me to know what we're talking about when we use the word Christian, although I do the same thing. My main focus is on evangelical conservative fundamentalist Christianity because I find them the most obnoxious, the ones who create the most problems in society, the ones that are the most certain, and the ones who damn the rest of us to hell. And I kind of get upset when people do that to me. So I focus on them. And when it comes to their arguments, the best arguments, I'm thinking, I would have said at one time different answers because, as I learned more about how to refute those answers, there are fewer of them, in fact, to the point where now I wouldn't say there are any. I wouldn't say there's not one single argument that leads to anything remotely possible to their faith. There's nothing there. You name it, I don't see there's any reason to accept any of those arguments. They're all bogus. They're all nothing but confirmation bias run amok. There's special pleading all the way down. I got 11 books, not self-published, but published books, and with some experts in areas where I'm not an expert that debunk everything from the Shroud of Turin to the Bethlehem Star of Jesus to the Exodus and supposedly Moses' day to in the theology of, say, original sin, free will, the fine-tuning argument, the Kalam. There's just nothing out there after studying so much that I find has a remote chance of being in defense of their specific Christian sect doctrines.
Okay. Now, speaking of obnoxious evangelical fundamentalists, you hail from the great state of Indiana. Indiana also gave us our esteemed Vice President, Mike Pence. A lot of people probably...
Sorry.
Yeah, a lot of people probably...
I didn't.
Yeah, a lot of people probably don't know much about him before he entered the national stage. But is there anything from his time as a governor in Indiana and his involvement in politics there that you think people should be aware of as they probably hopefully fight against him?
I think from everything I know, he is probably no question about it. He's a much more Savoy politician than Trump is, and he is much more principled, and he's much more dangerous. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that he's when Trump picked him to be his VP, we actually sighed a sigh of relief, thinking, "Whoo, we get rid of him too," because we didn't expect Trump to win. Mm-hmm. Whoo, 2-1, go! So we were quite surprised when he got the vice presidency.
Yeah. So if it weren't obvious enough, when it comes 2024, and if we're all still here and haven't been nuked out of existence or whatever disasters I'm picturing coming from we didn't think we were going to have one administration from Trump, much less two, but who knows what's going to happen.
Who knows what's going to happen.
So, well, before we wind up here, is there anything, I don't know when this is coming out, so I don't know of any events that may be pluggable, but do you have any other ways people can find out more about you, any books that you may have coming?
How much time?
Jim will give you all the time you want.
All right, well, you can edit it and make it into a separate thing, but my next anthology is coming out in October. This about a month away, and it's called The Case Against Miracles. Now, I started this book a year ago, and that was before Lee Strobel's book. I knew of his book, and his book is called The Case for Miracles. So it was quite aptly. I found out his book was published, that mine is aptly titled The Case Against Miracles. But I got the authors to write chapters for it long before I heard that his book was in the works. And it's a great answer to his book. And in Lee Strobel's book, he has a chapter where he interviews Michael Shermer. And so, and then the rest of the book can mention that chapter. Like they mentioned Michael Shermer. Like he said this in the first chapter, and here I want to say that in response. So he gets a lot of disputes with his views, right? Well, Michael Shermer read my manuscript and decided to write the foreword to it. So there's sort of it's interesting. It looks like a direct response to Lee Strobel's book, even the Michael Shermer part. And so I'm pretty happy about that, and I'm also pretty happy about what he said in the foreword. And I want to quote him. This is like a blurb, if you will. Shermer says, "Of my book coming out, I thought I knew a lot on these topics, inasmuch as I was once a born-again Christian myself and made these arguments, then became a born-again skeptic debating believers. But I learned more from reading this one book than all other works combined. The Case Against Miracles belongs in every library and personal bookcase of both believers and skeptics." Now, when I read that, when he said that to me, I said, "Whoa, you can't be serious." And at first I wanted to say, "Are you really Michael Shermer? Come on, you can't say that. Nobody would say that who's well educated on these issues." And so I treaded lightly. I thought, okay, wait, calm down, give him a few days, But it was really from him, and he really means that, because I asked him about it, and I'm really thrilled that that's on there because it helps the book get known. And so The Case Against Miracles, it has some really good authors in it, and it's a major. I think it's a major defense of David Hume's arguments against miracles. David Hume wrote a chapter in one of his books. It's 8,700 words long, and it's widely disputed and defended, but mostly recently widely disputed this point or that point. And people might be interested to learn that there's a lot of arguments against Hume, even coming from some atheists like Graham Obi and John Ehrman and others. So this, on the other hand, is a major defense of Hume's arguments, and I think we do it successfully. It's in part because of a new book that came out while we were in production stages by William Vandenberg called David Hume, Evidence of Miracles, and it's one of those expensive books. You buy that, you're paying like $100 or more. I think it may be coming down even as I speak. I've noticed it was maybe $66 now. But he was so gracious to give me a free copy of that book, and while we were doing this, and so I wrote an appendix, which is basically a review of his book, and he has a masterful defense of David Hume, which I was defending in my own chapter before I got his book. So it was nice to see that we collaborated, and it'll be surely. I think it's going to advance the discussion. That's what you're looking for in a book like that. Does it advance the discussion? Are we? And I'm trying to send it back to those days when people took Hume seriously and could interpret him in light of everything else he said. And I think we do it, and I think we do it in a good way.
All right, so we'll look forward to that coming out here pretty soon. And John, thank you for joining us. It's really great having you on the show. And thanks for watching, everyone. Like and subscribe to Atheist Edge. We'll see you next time.